So everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Couple admin things before we get started. This webinar will be recorded. So if you have to jump early or want to share this with a colleague or want to revisit certain areas, later this afternoon, you'll get a follow-up email that will include that recording from today. If you're interested, we don't have any slides today, so won't be passing those along. But we really hope this will be an interactive discussion today. Keaton will get into intros and everything here shortly, but I definitely ask if questions pop up for each other, for our great panelists today, please throw those in the chat. And we'll try and answer some of those kind of throughout the webinar as they're aligned with the certain topics and questions that we're on. And then any questions we don't get to, we'll save for the end. And if we just ultimately run out of time, we will follow up via email. I can reach out to these guys, and if they're willing, or we can reach out to others, we'll follow up through email and get you those answers as well. So with that, Keaton, I will pass it to you to get us started with some intros.
Yeah, thank you. And to echo Lucas, I appreciate everyone for joining. I see a lot of new names and a lot of familiar names as well. So going to be a really great conversation today. I'll start with introducing myself. Like Lucas mentioned, my name's Keaton Tanzer. I'm the sales manager for Rivial. I've been with us for coming up on 8 years now. Here in January of 2026 will be officially 8 years. And so excited to help coordinate and get some really great information out of the team we have here. Kind of start with introductions around on our side here. Darren, you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Keaton. My name is Darren. I'm the Senior Vice President, Information Security Officer at NBKC Bank. NBKC is about $1.3 billion in asset size. We do a lot in forms of mortgage lending, traditional banking, and then we also have a fairly significant fintech arm that we do some things with some fintech companies and things like that.
Awesome. Thank you, Darren, for joining. And Mike, what about you?
Thanks, Keaton. My name is Mike Sloan. I am the Associate Vice President and Information Security Officer at the University of Kentucky Federal Credit Union. I've been with the credit union about 6 years, started out as a systems administrator, and like I said, now I oversee the cybersecurity program.
Awesome. And certainly, last but not least, Lucas.
Well, potentially least, I am the fill-in panelist today. Our third one, unfortunately, had something come up in a conflict. So I'm kind of filling in. I'm Lucas Hathaway. I'm with Rivial, and I get to work with a lot of different banks and credit unions. So I'm here today to kind of share my side from what I hear from multiple different clients, from what we hear from a lot of credit unions, a lot of banks, as we go through the different topics and things Keaton runs through today. And we'll just be kind of sharing a summarized client perspective, trends I've seen kind of as we go through today. So I've been with Rivial about 11 years now. I do a lot of these webinars, meet with a lot of examiners on the NCUA and FDIC side with our clients. So we'll try and share some perspectives from them as well. So thank you guys for joining. Excited.
Awesome. And we have a few areas that we're going to cover as far as topics today. Things around 2025 findings and examiner expectations, AI risk, third-party budget strategy for 2026. So a lot of great areas that we're going to cover today. And I think let's dive in and start getting some insights. Again, if you have any questions, follow-up comments, anything like that, please drop them into the chat. I have that open for us. So we'll be covering that throughout the webinar. So starting with our first question here is, across your institution, what are the most common or surprising exam findings from 2025? I understand both of you run a great shop, so if there are no findings or you don't want to share those, I completely understand. Would love to know kind of what are some maybe surprising areas that examiners dug into that you weren't expecting. So kind of open this up. We'll start with Mike, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Keaton. Honestly, this year was probably one of the smoother exams we had. We got our list, we provided what was asked for, and honestly, it was pretty quiet after that. But I think that was a large part in due to we took a real hard look at continuous compliance late last year. I think I probably speak for a lot of people. Usually you get that list, and it's like scrounging, trying to figure out what you provided in years past. Everybody's just trying to, I call it chaos, right? And that's what it really turns into. This year, it was much smoother. We provided that. And like I said, knock on wood or something, but we didn't get a lot of feedback, which I took as a good thing.
Awesome. Yeah. And we'll kind of chat about that here next is how to be exam ready and get those things prepared. So excited to hear about what you've been working on with that. Darren, what about yourself? Anything, surprising or unexpected from examiners this year?
Obviously from a banking standpoint, a big thing we dealt with was obviously the transition off the FFIC CAT tool with it being sunset. So, how we were, reassessing our cybersecurity. So, that was definitely a topic item. Not that there were really any findings. I thought we have done a pretty good job of remapping that. We were leveraging the CRI profile. But so, just a process, there was several questions about that. For us, having a little bit of that fintech arm of our business, vendor management, how we're looking at those fintech companies, those organizations, how we're evaluating them. Several questions about, how we're handling that from that aspect. And we got a little bit of a transition, I think, this time around, you know, more functional type testing versus tabletop. So, how are we really proving that, what we say we can do, we can do. So I think there was some emphasis we saw a little bit there. Also with training around some of those plans and things like that. So
Yeah. Do you have it documented? Are you really ready if the proverbial S hits the fan, right?
yeah,
And how are you documenting that? Totally makes sense. Lucas, I'm curious. Darren brought up something. One, I mean, of course, across everything that we see from all of our financial institution clients, the CAT tool going away, kind of ASAT not being supported. Has there been a big push for a specific framework, or kind of what are the best, you know, success stories that you've seen across all of our clients?
Yeah, I haven't seen a push for a specific framework. Just that you're aligning and pick one internally. As the ASET for credit unions, CAT for banks, as that's kind of gone away. The ASET they're still supporting, but again, same controls. But they're saying to choose a framework to align to internally, and I haven't seen them push towards one specifically. CRI, NIST, CRS profile, NIST, and CIS are probably the three we see the most as far as organizations aligning to. And Darren, I actually had a follow-up question for you. You mentioned them wanting to see some more practical testing rather than just tabletops. Did they elaborate on kind of what they wanted to see around that and how they wanted that to be accomplished?
yeah, we've tried to been trending that way. With we have redundant circuits, so actually turning off a circuit and really
Gotcha.
showing that we can operate, um, you know, beyond just walking through, hey, this is what we do, or this is what we would do, or things like that. Um, you know, can we actually demonstrate that we could recover from a ransomware and things like that?
Yeah.
So just a little bit more, again, functional testing versus just that tabletop. So
Awesome. No, thank you for sharing. That's super helpful and I think a great insight. The other areas kind of Keaton that I've seen touched on that where examiners been focusing more. One big one is vulnerability management. I don't know if they brought this up for either of you guys, but a lot of our clients they really dug into what they're doing for vulnerability management, how they're prioritizing, how they're remediating, what kind of trend reports they're showing as far as improvement. So that's a common one I've heard brought up a lot. Then Darren, as you mentioned, I don't think it was just you. Third party and vendor management has been brought up a lot this year as far as looking at fourth parties, looking at how you're reviewing security for the vendors and tracking that is something we've heard a lot as well. The only other two specific ones that I know have come up multiple times this year is really the board understanding of risk tolerance. So setting a risk tolerance and ensuring the board understands and is aligned with it. And then the other piece is around incident response. It wasn't more practical testing like you were saying, Darren, but I think that's a great insight and a great idea. But really around definitions. The bank that came out with a new 72-hour reporting rule and credit unions followed as well. And those have been around a while now, but still defining what is a reportable breach or reportable incident to regulators. We've seen that come up a lot and making sure that's kind of clearly defined in the plan as far as when we report, who reports it, is kind of another common trend we've seen as well this year.
And Lucas, I'll mention a little bit on that. We've tended to, I guess, over-report maybe. So we report a lot more than we haven't had any issues from any of our examiners of us just reporting anything that we feel that they might be aware of. And I think that's helped a lot with the kind of that that aspect of what are you reporting or things like that. So.
And that's always my recommendation as well, is when in doubt, over report. I mean, everyone, it's a business decision. It's certainly up to the organization, but I think that's definitely the safe way to play it.
Yeah, Mike, I know you said you had a smooth exam. Was there anything specifically around the incident response or tabletop testing or testing of plans that you guys did specifically that worked with your examiner?
Not as much from the examiner, but kind of to piggyback off what everybody else is saying. One thing we did do this year, which was different for us, was we did like a simulation, a ransomware simulation, where we set up test machines and had a company come in and actually try to, detonate that with our defenses to see how we would respond. And that was really interesting, and I think takes it, matures that incident response from just theoretical to actually how you will respond. So that was really, really cool for us.
That's awesome.
Yeah, great idea to do if you can get that project going for the year, to be able to actually, again, kind of test those controls and those plans. So kind of next question here is what steps can an organization take in 2026 to be more exam ready? So not have that crazy rush to have to gather everything, or maybe concerns that the examiner is going to look in a place where you don't want them to look, and all of that. What are some things that you guys have done to help be prepared, and maybe some tricks or tips for people for 2026? Darren, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it's all about, continuously being prepared, kind of like that, what Mike was talking about, that continuous assessment. So, as, if you have a ticketing system, collecting those reports and adding them into a system that, you can refer back to. You don't have to, all of a sudden, run a report of what all the tickets have been, or things like that. Or, again, just making sure that your policies are in the same spot, that you have verification. We collect our board minutes every quarter, and instead of waiting till the right before to do that, or things like that. So I think, again, it's really just about that continuous cycle about collecting that information, having it available. So again, it's not that oh my gosh, here we got to collect it all. Here's the 50, 60 questions or the items they want to have, and we've got to go find where they're at. So I think, again, it's about that continuous build up, and just so when they come in, you have the information that they're going to want. So.
Yeah. And I know you said at the beginning, you touch a lot of different areas at the bank. Is there anything that you do specifically when you need to gather that information from other business units to kind of help get that from people that might not be as driven as you in real time?
Yeah, I mean, we have ongoing tasks, like I say, that trigger, so each month, there may be a handful, 10, 12 different tasks that, okay, I need to collect this information, get it over here, things like that. So again, it's not that last minute rush that I'm reaching out. So everybody knows what the tasks are. They're scheduled. They're going to the people. If they're not completed, there's follow up. There's alert levels and things that happen for it. So again, those tasks are happening continuously versus waiting till the end to try to collect all that.
Absolutely. Mike, what about yourself? Anything that you've been doing over this last year? I know you said you kind of started this in 2024 of that continuous compliance aspect, but anything you've been doing that was very successful for you in 2025 and plans for 2026?
Yeah, I mean, as I kind of alluded to earlier, it was a game changer, I would say, for us. Like even feedback from those other departments that are providing information, like hearing from them, like oh wow, it was so much easier this year. I didn't have to drop what I'm working on, what my focus is, to go grab evidence. I think at one point we kind of guesstimated, we probably saved almost 12 hours across the exam time this year, which is fairly
Oh, awesome.
substantial in my opinion.
Yeah, day and a
Um,
half.
and we're getting that buy-in. People see the value, so now it's just kind of continuing, keeping that snowball rolling into 2026.
Yeah, awesome. I know, kind of a shameless plug here, Mike, but when I was at the Jack Henry conference earlier this year for their annual convention that they do, someone had come up to me and be like, "Oh, I get the Rivial notifications, and this is so nice. I didn't have to even interact with Mike."
Yeah, yeah. That kind of feedback I love hearing. Like when people are smiling, because usually when security comes knocking, people are not smiling. So when I can see the smiles on people's faces, that always makes for a good time.
Yeah, and they should be smiling with you. Lucas, one of the first things, when I first started with Rivial was the analogy of going to the dentist. You brush your teeth every day, so that way by the time you go to the dentist, you don't have some major surgery. And we've always kind of incorporated that over here at Rivial. Anything that you've seen, be successful, not even just this year, but in the past, with kind of helping streamline, or even outside of what we do here with our platform, but if somebody could take that on their own, ways that they could
Yeah.
be better prepared for an exam.
Yeah, I think the key is, it's examiners will have their own focus areas, that we were just kind of talking through, but the core of what they're going to ask for, good security is good security. And realistically, they want to see that you're aligning with whatever control framework you're aligning with. They're going to ask their core questions. They want to make sure you have good security in place. And so my kind of just two recommendations. The first one, these guys hit on very, perfectly, as far as just tracking documentation that align with those controls, and just tracking that documentation as you're going throughout the year. Don't save it till the end and go, okay, what are they going to ask for? What are we going to need? Ultimately, what they'll ask for. It might be in a different format, or, a different list, but those core controls, that framework you align with, make sure you're documenting that security stuff throughout the year. When the board meeting happens, as Darren, mentioned, save those meeting minutes, save that board report. When you go in to review your antivirus or your SIM, and those reports or those dashboards, just screenshot it, save it in a folder, save it, in a wherever makes sense for you, a folder, SharePoint, project management tool, etc. And then the final piece examiners really, I think, want to see is just that continuous improvement, right? There's no end goal of security. You're never done, thank goodness, or we'd all be out of jobs. But how do you keep getting better? And so I think that's the key is, okay, we have our framework, we're tracking our evidence and controls ongoing. Now, how did we get better this year? And if you can kind of clearly show the examiner, yeah, based on our risk assessment or based on an assessment we did, we saw we were weak in these areas. We saw we had risk in these areas. So we prioritized those, and here's how we've matured. Here's how we've improved since the last time you were here. I think just showing them that you have that mindset and are being proactive about improvement really makes them less hands off as well. It's like, okay, I don't have to dig in as deep. I don't need to, these guys are doing a great job. They're pushing themselves forward. They're right aware. They know where their gaps are. They know where they're strong. That makes my job easy. And so those are kind of the keys I've seen that I think makes for smoother exams, is when you're prepared and you're showing that improvement, you have everything documented and tracked.
Awesome. Yeah, and one thing I'd be curious to get, Darren and Mike, your thoughts on this, with that maturity piece of, we've gone through these exams, it's changed. How do you add that into your report to the board and executive leadership of, this is where we're at, this is where we've improved, this is how we're going to be? Any special things that you guys have into your annual board report or anything like that that helps communicate we're continuing to get better in security? Darren?
Yeah, I think that really will show up kind of in our framework report that we do, based on, maybe there was an area that we marked that we were partially complete or something like that. And then, we're showing that, we've, met that, item or that question set, things like that. So again, depending on the system, it is really just about that reporting to the board and giving them the visibility of where are we showing improvements or not. So.
Yeah. Mike, any thoughts there?
I'd kind of echo Darren. We use CIS for our internal framework, so we try to track our maturity and show that quarter over quarter, if possible. Sometimes there's not a lot of movement. And then there's some few other metrics we kind of measure around at-risk systems that are outside our risk tolerance and things of that. So that's really how we're showing our maturity, continuing on.
Awesome. And I think it leads into our second topic nicely, which is, I think, the words I have heard more this year and last year than ever before, which is AI. 20 conferences, it was 90% of the breakout sessions and product demos were all revolving around AI. And I think it's still an important conversation to have. But we want to kind of dive in and get your both opinions and thoughts on where your institutions are at with AI and how you're managing that. So both as a tool and as a threat, how are you incorporating AI related risks into your assessments? Michael, I'll start with you there and kind of we'll bounce around.
Yeah, sure. So we decided fairly early on that, we probably are not stopping AI anytime soon. So we tried to at least get in front of it as best we could. So we've had just a general policy and an acceptable use policy is kind of where we started at. Got that in front of all staff, to try to zone in on, what you should do with these types of tools and what you shouldn't. We partnered with our L&D department to create like actual customized training to kind of make it more operational. And then from there, we started really looking at the tool sets that we had. We're a heavy Microsoft shop, so using Purview to understand who and how we are using AI internally, and just looking to mature from there is kind of where we're at the moment, anyways.
Awesome. Darren, where's the bank at with AI?
Yeah, I'll echo some of what Mike said, but and now we're actually to the point where we're actually starting to create some specific use cases where we're going to need to utilize AI, whether that's in our lending departments or, what, our software development is doing with some of their AI initiatives and stuff like that. So we're creating use cases, to really look at, what we might need to do additionally. But I think that's kind of where we're at right now, really hard evaluating those use cases. Obviously, then we'll take those use cases and depending on whether it's, like Microsoft's AI or whether it's a vendor that's providing that AI, we'll have to really start evaluating where we have to go from, assessing the risks associated with those different AI systems. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Walk before you run, maybe. I talk to a lot of financial institutions where I don't want to be that first headline, the first guy in the headline. And so getting that feeler of where is it going to be impacting first makes total sense. Lucas, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts because you kind of get it from multiple different places. You get it from our side of stuff where we're product, we're vendor, we're needing to introduce AI for efficiencies and those types of things, along from the governance side of things of institutions that are all the way in and people that are not even saying no way we're not going to join AI revolution at all. What are some ways that you've seen financial institutions incorporate AI into their control management, to their threat management, and those?
Yeah, I can echo. I think a lot of people are kind of right where Mike and Darren are at, admittedly. I actually saw a recent survey of financial institutions, and I was shocked. It was either a fourth or a third aren't allowing it at all yet. It's like, hey, nope, we're not doing it yet. So that was bigger than I'd expected it to be. And maybe there's just some tools that have it and they don't know about it yet, and they're trying to mitigate that. I'm not sure yet, but about a third of financial institutions currently are still just trying to avoid it. So I thought that was fascinating. But for the ones that aren't, which is still the majority, I've seen, really some of those first steps, the policy, acceptable use, letting employees know what they can and can't use, I think is key. And then starting to implement it in the risk assessment. As you mentioned, Keaton, obviously we're starting to roll out our, including in our cyber risk assessment, including AI. Because AI introduces a ton of new threats, a ton of new controls. So we're rolling out, risks specific to data issues, operational issues that cover model drift and bias, model training issues, legal, ethical, and regulatory issues, kind of all those things that are adjacent to cybersecurity, that are very specific to AI. So we've rolled out new risks and threat categories around AI and new controls as well, that we're starting to leverage to just help folks assess that risk more. The other areas I've seen people start to improve is really around their vendor management process, because most tools that we're acquiring, as you mentioned, Mike, as far as Microsoft and stuff, right? It's a vendor, and so making sure you're documenting their controls, what options they have for controls around AI, what the organization is responsible for testing. So starting to incorporate that in the vendor management and the third-party risk management process. And then the other new one is really incident response playbooks for AI events. So not like a cyber event or incident where maybe data's leaked. It could be, but maybe it's the model drift or model bias, and it made a bad lending decision, or it's whatever that may be. How do we handle those events? How do we handle those incidents? And really incorporating that into incident response. And the final thing I've seen a couple credit unions start to do that are like really all in, already have tools stood up is create like an AI specific committee, even where they stood up internally an AI committee that will start making decisions around this going forward, oversee the policy creation, the governance components of it. So it really is quite a spectrum as far as what we've seen with different folks, but those are some of the things we've seen them start to implement.
Yeah, from the committee perspective, Mike, Darren, have either of you started to either kind of break that out as a sub conversation of steering committee, or start to really stand up your own AI committee going forward?
Yeah, I think that's some plans that we are looking at doing, is really kind of establishing who's going to own AI and kind of separate that out. So it's not really necessarily going to be me, or maybe like say we're going to develop a team around where we have the expertise to really handle and build that committee and that infrastructure out. So,
Awesome. What about yourself, Mike?
Interestingly enough, we had our IT steering committee meeting yesterday afternoon, and this very topic came up. So it's something we're actively starting to look at, about having like a subcommittee or something that's just focused on AI in general. We're not there yet, but that topic did just come up.
Awesome. What about from an examiner standpoint? I know we talked about that earlier. Did it come up in your exams at all, the AI? We'll start with Darren there.
not, obviously there's some questions. Again, we had some, we've done some of the beginning stuff, acceptable use, things like that. So, that means we don't have, full adoption of it, or things like that. It wasn't necessarily a heavy topic, but now that we are really starting to really develop our use cases and really push for it. I mean, we want to make sure we have the controls and the things around that to where you can show that we're doing what we need to do as we start implementing.
Yeah. What about you, Mike? Was it brought up with your exam this year?
They were excited to see that we had the policies in place. And then we did, maybe not so much from the exam point of it, but they were inquisitive about how we were using Purview to block certain AI tools that we deem unacceptable or whatever, based on risk score within Purview. So outside of that, it wasn't too much more kind of surface level.
Gotcha. Would you mind sharing what that risk score was and kind of where that line was drawn? Just curiosity.
Yeah, so in Purview, or in Microsoft Cloud, whatever they're calling it now, the CASB piece of it, they have risk scores based on a bunch of topics. So we kind of took a stronger approach to it. So anything that comes in lower than, I think, 8 is how our policy is written right now. It just unsanctions that, so we'll not allow it when somebody tries to go to it. If it's above that, we're actually allowing it at the moment, and starting to work on, the data side of it to understand, what kind of data is actually being used in prompts and things. Works a lot better from my point of view if you're using Copilot than any of the other ones, obviously, since it's a Microsoft product. But
Sure.
We've had pretty good success with it so far.
No, I love that there's a risk tolerance conversation around there. It's not just finger in the wind. Oh, I think, or right. I mean, you have to be able to define what those are. And so I actually haven't heard that before. So that's really cool. Um, Lucas, I have a question for you that actually came from the chat, and kind of curious about what you've seen across all of our financial institutions. Then I'll pass this over to Darren and Mike. But the question came in, and it's what about AI and automating stress testing for a financial institution? Where have we seen that fall in from the governance and the compliance and just the overall acceptance of that for our institutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. My hunch is referring to like stress testing and applications. But admittedly, we haven't come across it a ton. Well, we don't deal a ton with application development as far as, in our clients, unless it's around a control or risk perspective. So admittedly, I haven't heard or seen of many folks doing that. But Mike or Darren, I'd love to pass it to you if you guys have any
Yeah.
insights there. I don't know if either of you guys are doing in-house development or not, or using that piece.
From our point of view, yeah, I don't really have much to add to that either. We don't do in-house development, so stress testing as far as application goes, we probably would not be doing anything like that currently.
I think from our aspect, and we do have some software development. But as far as again, what they're doing from an AI perspective is they're really leveraging some additional vendors. So our AI work a lot right now is evaluating that vendor and assessing what they're doing from, how their policies or how their approach is. And I think that's where a lot of people are going to first run into the AI is their vendor's going to be using it. So how are you assessing your vendor? And going back to that vendor management piece, how are you understanding what they're doing from an AI perspective, and how are they controlling it, and how does that affect your data and things like that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, is from the vendor perspective, and that's actually our next topic. So thank you for the very easy segue into third party breach response, coordination with those vendors. Starting from that review of capabilities and controls and just overall kind of deep dive into security vendors, we've seen a lot in the past where it's been, oh, there's no exceptions in the SOC report, or I get the documentation or a questionnaire back and they said yes on everything, so we must be good. Have you seen anything change with the introduction of more capabilities from vendors, more security scrutiny from vendors when performing those vendor security reviews?
Again, it's all about, we're following what our policies state, what we're going to do, what we're going to collect, what we're going to look for. Again, we have vendors, we also have fintech partners. So those, there's different review requirements, based on whether they're a vendor, whether they're a fintech partner, whether they're one of our brand partners, or whether they're an FBO, things like that. So, again, we've definitely established different levels of what we're going to look at, what we're going to review. Obviously, tiers of what the risk of that vendor, things like that, dictates what we're going to look for, what we're going to do. But again, we are building out that whole, now it's, how are they using AI? That's a factor into that vendor review, as well as, all the other things that we're trying to look for. So.
What about your end there, Mike? Has it changed your security, review or vendor due diligence reviews?
Not yet, but this is something, and I'm probably jumping ahead a little bit, but this is something we're looking really into for 2026, is how to utilize AI on our side, right? Small team, right? Lots of vendors. Just realizing how we can take advantage of that tool set to do a more in-depth, thorough, standardized, consistent review of our vendors, right?
Yep.
So that's really where we're kind of focusing on in the real near future.
Awesome. Well, I saw Lucas change his seat, and you might not. It was a subtle movement, but I saw Lucas change. This is actually something that we've talked a lot about here on the Rivial side. We've been doing detailed security reviews for a long time, and trying to get out of those just questionnaire looks there. Kind of, Lucas, your thoughts on that of reviewing vendor security before we kind of dive into what happens if that breach actually does occur.
Yeah, I obviously think it's critical. Um, I have a whole presentation on this. Actually, I gave it a conference last month. So, to summarize, I think I think you guys covered it well. As far as I see a lot of folks, just send out a questionnaire, use the responses, and call it good. And unfortunately, the issue with that is always a lot of times it's salespeople or an organization who wants your money, right? They want to start working with you. They want your money. They're going to say yes. They want to make you happy, and ultimately that isn't always the best for security. And so I always recommend assessing your vendors against the same controls that you assess yourself against internally. All your vendors, if they're going to have your customer or member data, you're ultimately responsible for their security program in a sense. It's an extension of your program. And so I always recommend leveraging, okay, if you align with CIS internally, if you align with NIST internally, make sure you're assessing your vendors against that same control set. And ideally avoid questionnaires if you can. You leverage documentation, whether they're providing policies, whether it's a SOC report, ideally SOC 2 Type 2, or any other independent attestation where you can see, okay, you can go through that and actually determine, do they have this NIST control in place? Do they have this CIS control in place? So you're comparing them against the same standard you're comparing yourself against. So you get a really clear picture of their risk and whether or not you're willing to accept that. So that's always my biggest recommendation as far as reviewing security for vendors, for third parties, as they're getting more and more data, as we're outsourcing more and more things.
Awesome. Thank you, Lucas. As far as a vendor breach goes, I know we talked about more material testing and probably deeper dive type testing. Uh, with the increase of vendor risk and a vendor breach, how have the scenarios changed for your incident response planning and your playbooks and your testing? How has that changed at the institutions? Darren, since you kind of went over this a little bit earlier, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the vendor side of the breach.
Yeah, I mean, we actually include our vendors in some of our testing now. So our policy states that at least one of our tests that we do throughout the year will be with one of our either vendors or our partners or things like that. Obviously, from a vendor review perspective, really looking at the contracts, the SLAs, making sure that they're reporting, they have reporting requirements to us, obviously, because we have reporting requirements. So, really embedding some of that into the contracts, making sure the SLAs address. And then, again, when you're looking at, XYZ vendor, if you're looking at their SOC and their infrastructure, if they say they're, only in AWS East 1, that could possibly be a problem, as we realized not too long ago. So really kind of looking at some of that stuff more detail, and really kind of being a little bit more nitpicky about what we're seeing, what we're getting from them, and if they can't provide that information or they are not willing to, do we really want to have them as a vendor? So
It doesn't sound like a very good partnership at that point as well. So, Mike, what about yourself?
I'd agree with Darren on the contracts. That's one area we've started looking into a little more deeper. Also, we've been lucky to onboard a chief legal and risk officer who has really brought that to our attention. Right, it's been a great skill set to get. So really, just working with our vendors, our partners, to understand how we both can help each other, make that partnership. Get those SLAs in, understand what response looks like from their end, right? Like when will we know? And really diving into, fourth party, even like understanding what vendors they use, because honestly, that's what keeps me up most at night out of everything is, the vendor relationships and what's going to happen to my members if they're breached.
Yeah, absolutely. And every single conversation I have about vendor management and vendor security, fourth party vendors come into play. How are you managing that and looking at handling the vendor fourth party risk?
Right now, we are not. I'm just being honest. It's something on our roadmap and something we're starting to step into, but really kind of figuring out what that framework looks like, how we are going to track. Just figuring out visibility into it is key, the first step, and then just building on it from there. So
Yeah. Darren, what about yourself? Has fourth party been something that you guys are tracking, or have any tips and tricks there?
Yeah, well, we've again, like Mike said, we really started again with when we have our conversations with our third parties. We really are pushing them to, okay, what are your critical relationships? We want to see those, we want to understand those, and then we also want to understand what your due diligence is against those. So, if they say, well, we're not doing anything, well, obviously that's a current concern, and that's something we have to address with them. So yeah, when those relationships are starting to be established again, we're really taking that approach is, okay, we want to look at, tell us who your fourth parties are, and then tell us what your due diligence is against them. So
Absolutely.
kind of like what Lucas said, really taking the lens of what are we required to do, and then push that back down to them as well.
Yeah. Lucas, any ways to track that at the institutions? Have you seen anything, or yeah, it's
Oh,
a loaded
there,
gun of a
there's no
question.
Yeah, there's no easy button for this one, unfortunately. There's some tools out there that'll track fourth parties, for the big ones, the AWS is the Microsoft, and you can see fourth parties if they're using any of the cloud providers, and those do a solid job as a starting point. But to really do it right, unfortunately, it's fairly manual still from what I've seen. And the two biggest ways I always recommend are one, just having a central place to track it, software, project management tool, spreadsheet, doesn't matter, and then pulling them from the SOC report, the subservice organizations they call out in the SOC report, at least things that their software or SaaS application or, depending on the type of service provider it is, should be called out there, that it relies on. And so pulling them out of the SOC report, tracking those subservice organizations. And then the other piece is just kind of questionnaire, like Darren, you mentioned, asking them and making sure that what's in the SOC report and those subservice organizations align with what they say is critical to them, and then just tracking that with the vendor. And one of the biggest reasons is to just know if there is a breach. We've all heard of the Move It breach, or all these different things when Log4j came out, right? You can quickly see, okay, who am I using that might, you can query and sort filter whatever, whether it's in a spreadsheet or tool, who am I using and who might be affected by that. So you can really shorten your list of who you need to reach out and check in with, as far as, hey, we have documented you're using this vendor. Are you affected by this? Is any of our data affected by this? To try and get on top of, that notification, as you guys were all, speaking to. Hopefully it's in the contract. Hopefully there are SLAs of how quickly they need to notify you to trigger that incident response plan internally. But this can kind of help you be a little more proactive when we do find out about a breach somewhere, is to determine, are any of my third parties affected, by tracking that. But unfortunately, I haven't seen yet an easy way to do it. There's some tools out there that help with it, but the most accurate we've seen is pulling from the SOC report and then cross-checking that just with the vendor through questionnaire.
Awesome. What about from an examiner standpoint, guys? Have we did you see any of the examiners pressing harder for the vendor incident response evidence? So kind of on that vendor side of things, or you know, Darren, kind of what was the response from adding the vendors into the tabletop exercise? I'm assuming it was probably pretty positive.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely was a positive thing that was brought out, and it actually came up prior to any exams. We were actually going through just an internal audit, and that was brought up that hey, we should include one of our fintechs or one of our partners with what we're doing from a testing standpoint. But nothing specific that was required by an examiner or anything like that. But they were very appreciative of seeing that. So.
Mike, what about yourself?
We didn't really get any specific questions about it from the examiners. As Darren mentioned, doing those tabletops where we had one earlier this year where we did pretend, right, in air quotes, that one of our vendors was the one that was actually suffering the incident, and how does that affect us directly? Can we work around and things like that? So it was pretty eye-opening for us, and I think we're planning on doing more of those types of exercises.
Awesome. And then just document and save it. So from a 2026 perspective, I know we spent the last 45 minutes talking about 2025. So we have about 10 minutes left, 15 minutes left to talk about 2026. Hard to believe that Thanksgiving is next week. Heading into budget season, I'm not sure kind of where you guys are at in your budget season, or anybody listening, but heading into budget season, are there any specific controls, initiatives, anything you're doing to deliverable a more measurable risk reduction? And what are some of your top priorities for next year? Mike, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So our overall focus for 2026 is really just continue to maturize and optimize what we currently have. We want to make sure that, the investments we've made in the current tool set, we're getting all of the usage out of it that we can. From there, though, I think, we are focusing, as we mentioned, on vendor management, on how to consistently assess those vendors against our internal controls, as Lucas mentioned earlier. Outside of that, AI, obviously, that's always going to be an ongoing thing, and figuring out how to innovate and innovate securely, enable the business to say yes to that innovation for our members.
Do you see the board asking about that, or is it something that you want to bring to the board?
Kind of a little of both. We're lucky, I guess is the word I'll use. We have security-minded people on our board. So it's it makes it a little easier to have those types of conversations, right? Wrapping them around business impact, and not just speak the tech jargon. So definitely a mutual situation we're in right now.
Yeah. Ben, what about yourself? 2026, kind of goals and priorities.
Yeah, a lot, some similar, just maturing of what we currently have, what we're doing, utilizing what we have, but we're kind of a little bit on what we call a simplify mode. So, when we look at things such as identity access management, how can we simplify that for the user? How can, how much, fully implementing SSO across all of our applications, or, can we do passwordless, or we can do passkeys? How can we simplify some of those things for our users? Especially around onboarding, offboarding. Really looking at specific role-based access that, if you're in this role, you're automatically going to get this. And, how can we simplify, reviews around that going forward, things like that. So kind of a simplify mode, or especially, again, around patching. Patching is always key. How do we simplify? How do we make sure that, and we can show that we're improving, but yet not making it more complicated, not more work, things like that. And then I'd say we've definitely had some big initiatives around security awareness training around across everything that we're doing. Really, whether that's AI, whether that's, just phishing or whatever it is, but really trying to demonstrate and show that training is effective and that we're getting, results from that training. So we've got a big push into more training, maybe not as long, but, a little snippet type training that, versus, forcing somebody to go through a 1 hour annual training or something like that. We're trying to really, again, simplify, but also, make it valuable. So.
And with some of those, initiatives and investments, how are you framing that for the board? And have you seen throughout your experience anything that works really specifically well with communicating those, investments to the board?
I think it's key that it's all around, if you can really just show some dollar value in that, that's what they're looking for, or, if we can demonstrate that we don't have to hire this full-time employee or something like that. I think it's key that, to get away from the demonstration of, well, I'm taking my risk from high to medium, or my risk from medium to low. Well, what does that really mean? So, from the bank and perspective and things like that. So again, initiatives around showing, value, whether it's dollars or employees and things like that, that I think that's really what's driving the board to make decisions.
Awesome. Mike, any thoughts on that from the reporting and measuring and communicating that piece to the board?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what we've talked about, just really tying it back to business impact. Security for the sake of security, right? That's not our business model. We're here to serve our members. An example I like to always throw out there, right, is my leadership really probably don't care to hear about the latest, greatest AI-enabled machine learning email filter. But what they do like to hear is if I can tie that to how this investment will keep phishing emails out of users' mailboxes and continue that way they can continue providing those services to our members. The ears perk up a little more there. So I think anytime you can really justify it around business impact, I've had better success anyways with my leadership.
Awesome. Lucas, I'd love to know as try to unbiased as possible with that, because you've reported these, to many different types of boards. I think you'll probably echo a lot of the same thing, but what have you seen that has really resonated with the boards that you've presented to?
Yeah, admittedly, nothing these guys haven't hit on. I think Darren, Mike, you guys nailed it. I mean, it's really comes down to when we see the board not resonate, there's a bunch of technical stats. Here's how much spam we blocked. Here's what the antivirus stuff is. When you're really getting in the weeds and throwing a ton of numbers at them, half the time, again, some boards are very cyber savvy, but the majority of the time, most are going, okay, what does this really mean? They care about what it means. And I think, Mike, you said it perfect. What does it mean for our members? And so where we've seen the most success, where we've seen ears perk up, or where it's simple. And this is actually next month, our webinar topic is all on reporting cybersecurity to the board. So Keen, it's a great question. But what we've seen is keeping it simple in language they understand, as you both hit on, as far as if you can tie it back to whether it's dollars and cents or at least business impact in some way. This will save X time and tie that back to dollars and cents. It will reduce X amount of risk in dollars, and here's the ROI on it. Or here's how it will positively impact our members or employees and make them better off in some way. When you can keep it simple, tell the story, and speak in their language, I think that's when you get the most impact. You get those items approved that you need to really mature the security program, even from the technical side, if you can tie it back to the business and in a language that they understand.
Awesome. Any tips that you've learned for the peers out there for going into their budget season and building out their program? Mike?
Just understand what your business is trying to do, understanding those strategic points. Where are we going? Are we looking to grow? Are we, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? And then figure out, how security can help your organization get there. It could be a multitude of different things, right? But the more you stay in line with where the strategy is going, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. And what you said earlier too, with not security for the sake of security. We're not just buying every single fancy shiny tool because it's a fancy shiny tool and we have to do something, but how is it going to reduce risk? How is it going to improve customer member experience? Because ultimately, security isn't this loss leader that you have to do anymore. It really impacts business because it's ingrained into everything and it's all technically driven. And so I think that's a really, really good point. Darren, what about yourself? Any kind of hidden tips or tricks that you've found over the years?
Yeah, we've kind of really had an emphasis and a push into risk isn't a security focus. Risk is a business focus. So again, going back to your business impact, your things like that. So we try to, at each department level, really make them try to own their risk, and I can help them point out areas or things like that, give them some advice and things like that, but ultimately they own that risk. Information security doesn't own the risk. So when the department starts owning their risk and they're responsible for it, I think that drives a different approach to everything that happens. So
yeah, just how risky do you want to be? Lucas, any specific tips that you haven't covered already?
I don't think so. Honestly, obviously I'm less involved generally in the budgeting process with a lot of organizations, but I think the keys are, based on your risk assessment, look for the biggest ways to improve, whether from a risk reduction perspective or highest impact areas. I think that's one of the keys. Look to continue to mature, and show that and be able to show it. Make sure you have a metric or some way to show that maturity over time, show that improvement over time for your board, for your examiners. And if you can align with those two things as far as how you're continually improving, showing that you're prioritizing initiatives based on your risk assessment, I think you're going to be in really good shape. And these guys said it multiple times, but aligning with the business, aligning with the organization's goals, not just doing security, to do more security. Generally those things are going to go hand in hand, but really tying it back to, the organization wants to expand to 5 new branches. Awesome. From a security perspective, what priorities do you need to focus on to enable the business to expand securely and stand up 5 new branches or whatever that initiative may be? So I think that would be it from my perspective.
Yeah, the only thing I'd probably piggyback on is when you do those to really identify the return on investment for those decision makers. So that way you can communicate, listen, we're going to help, we're going to make sure it's secure, we're going to make sure that it all get done within our goals. But we don't, again, want to just throw endless amounts of money at something that maybe we could show a bigger return in other areas that could help produce that same result. And so I love that. We have about 3 minutes
Awesome.
left on the session here. Darren, Mike, any other specific items on kind of 2026 or budgeting or goals that you have for upcoming years? And I'd love to open it up if anybody has any questions that we can dive into the last few minutes here.
Nothing from my end. I think we hit a lot of the key things that we're looking at doing. So.
Yeah, same for me. I mean, just really diving in, understanding how we can make our organizations more secure.
Awesome. We'll open up to the attendees that are on the webinar here. Any other questions? Or I know we were kind of trying to get to them throughout the session here, but kind of give it a minute here. Any other questions that we can help answer?
All right. I'm not seeing any, but while that's open, I just want to say a quick thank you, Mike and Darren. Really appreciate you guys both joining, sharing insights. I learned multiple new things today, so I'm sure others did as well. So really appreciate you joining and kind of sharing what you guys are doing, what you're planning, what you're focusing on, and kind of what you've seen over this last year. And everyone else, thank you guys so much for joining. I'm not seeing any questions come through, but if any do come up, email us. We'll be sending out the recording later this afternoon. You can just reply to that email with any follow-ups, questions, and we can certainly pass along to these guys as well. So with that, we'll wrap things up here. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon and a wonderful Thanksgiving if we don't talk sooner.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. See y'all.